Okay, and we are live and recording. And a quick, where are we on the study roadmap? Today, we're going to cover community logins. We're also going to do a social sign-on demo. And Wednesday, the fun really starts. We start with OAuth. OAuth is a full third of the Identity and Access Management exam. And so we're going to spend 3 sessions dealing with OAuth and all the fun that it entails and all the different flows. So it's coming. It's our final day of non-OAuth stuff for a while. And so with that, we have 3 presenters, Jeff, Satish, and Jaseem. And Jeff, I see you're on, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, sounds good. I think I've clicked all the right buttons to share.
You did.
So let me first just kind of give a high-level overview of what I'm going to be stepping through. I'm going to hook up to Google Plus for sign-on. So this is not essentially, this is OpenID Connect. The way you hook up different identity providers, be it social or other, ends up being OpenID Connect. Salesforce gives us some special ways to do it for some common things like around Google, Facebook, and LinkedIn. But essentially, that's what we're exercising at OpenID Connect. So we're going to be going through many of the same steps that you do when you set up SAML. You kind of have to go back and forth between setting things up within Google, setting things up within Salesforce to get that connection to actually work. And to kind of just show that, I know it's probably hard to see here, but essentially we're going to have a client ID and a secret from Google that has to go into our Auth Provider in Salesforce. And then we're going to have a callback URL from Salesforce that has to go back into what we put into Google. So probably the best place to start here is just to jump right into Google and set up, because we need those 2 key pieces of information, the client ID and the client secret. So when we bounce over, if you've not done this before, essentially if you go to, and I have that there in the slides I'll put out there, console.developers.google.com. That's where you get things started off. Now, before you can really get going, you're going to have to create a project. I've already done that. It's a quick thing. You just name it whatever you want to do. In this case, I called it social sign-on. That just kind of collects everything together. From that point, you'll get into pretty much what you see here is a dashboard. And one of the items in there is credentials. So I'll start to create one just to kind of give you an idea how that works, but I've already got those things pre-configured. When we say we want to create a credential, you have to kind of tell them what kind. And the good thing they have here is there's a help down here. So if you say, well, I'm not sure what I'm doing, you can go down and click that help. And it kind of guides you through or tells you some of the different things you need to do. In some cases, you only need a consumer key. In other cases, you need both a key and a secret. I won't go through all that for time. That's something you can go back and look. I basically created the OAuth client ID in order to get things going here based on looking at those help me choose that guided through. And what I'll do is kind of just pop up one of those. And I've got 2 of them here because I want to talk about a little bit the second one, what you're getting from Salesforce kind of for free. We'll do that in a bit. So when you go in and look here, you're basically just defining a name. And ultimately, you've got to put in this redirect URI, but you don't have it right now. So once you've defined your name, you pretty much just save, and that gives you your client ID and your secret. Jumping over now into Salesforce, the way you manage all this is through an Auth Provider. We probably haven't talked about those yet here, but it's a way where you can define someone else who's going to provide authentication for you. And again, here you'll see that I have 2 set up to kind of talk about it in a little bit. Let me get out of, did that the wrong way. I'm going to get into the way I set it up, thinking I had to do everything. Then I'll go back and kind of show you what Salesforce gives us by default. So this particular case, when you first create one, and let's do that because I kind of jumped ahead here. When you say new, Salesforce provides multiple ways for you to do your identity. As you can see, you can look to another Salesforce org, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Google. So this is kind of some things Salesforce gives you out of the box. You could also go through and set this up as OpenID Connect just as a general type one and get each of these other things done, but you pick up some things by picking one of the ones. I, in this case, picked Google. And I'll show you in a bit what you get by doing that. But now we'll just kind of go back in and go through the general setup. So as we had that consumer key and a consumer secret from the other side, now that's where we place them. These next three URLs, this is kind of what you get for free when you pick that you want to go to Google. I actually went out to Google and found what those were and keyed those in. But as I was reading later, figuring out, so what benefit do I get out of picking, let's say, Google versus an OpenID Connect? And when you define it as Google, those three are really already known and you don't have to have them in there. You can still put them, it does not hurt. But because you're doing Google, behind the scenes, it knows what those URLs are. So in essence, you don't have to have those. And in my default, I went back to verify that. I left all three of those out, and it does still work by having those missing. So that's kind of the thing you pick up by having this provider type Google. You don't have to key in those URLs that essentially get brought, that guide you over to Google in order to get going. Again, once you've defined all these items, you'll get your URLs at the bottom. And the last important piece, and this is kind of the key to all of this, is this registration handler. And we've kind of talked about that. But what does that really mean? So when you go over to Google or LinkedIn or Facebook or any of those in order to do your authentication, you're going to key in credentials over there. You're going to tell Google who you are. But now Google has to come back to Salesforce and tell Salesforce who you are. And that's where within this handler, you have to define what it means into your system in order to do that authentication. With this class, and let me kind of go back. I'm jumping ahead here. It's hard to tell here when you edit this. You have the ability either to a class you've already created, you can search for it, or the very first time you do this, there's an extra link that says auto create this for you. So they'll go out and Salesforce will create you a class that has some of the basics in it. And that's what I did initially to get started here. But you've got to edit that thing. You can't go the way that thing comes out of the box. And let me kind of show you why. This class extends a particular interface. And what that interface has is two different methods. They have a create user and they have this is the next one I put in, and they have an update user. So when you come back from essentially your authentication, you're coming back into Salesforce, you have to decide whether you're going to go create a new user or you're going to update an existing user. Well, the very first time you've done this, you've not defined who that identification coming back from Google or LinkedIn or any of the other systems, you've not defined how that's going to map to your particular database. So the very first time somebody goes to log in, if you want to link them up to an existing user, you've got to provide the details of how to do that, because there's no connection right now that says whoever is within Google, how they're going to match over into Salesforce. So most of the cases where you're using either Google or LinkedIn or any of those other systems to log you into systems where you're not providing a link, what they're almost always doing, or actually not almost, what they're doing is creating a new user within the service provider coming back for the details that came from that identity provider, and then you're continuing on. But in this particular case, you've probably got Salesforce users already. You don't want to necessarily recreate them all the time. So you're going to have to define in this create user, because there's no way to match up every time they come over the first time, it's going to be create. You've got to define how to match that up. So what I've basically done here in the create user is knowing how I set up my development environment, it's basically my first name, last name, and I had a defined mechanism for what the rest of the user ID is. So I pull that information over from what I get from Google. I compare it against my user. If I actually find that user, then I'm going to return back. Well, in this particular case, I always return back the user. If I don't find a user that matches, then I'm actually going to go into my own method and go and create that user. At the end of that, I basically have a user record that returns. Otherwise, when I found the user already matched up to the credentials coming in, I return that. And that's how within this class, you can link up the information that's coming over and what you ultimately have within Salesforce. Now, this is the one-time method you have to do. Once you've logged this person in, and once you've connected these two, then there is there's an object that gets created within Salesforce called a third-party account link. And that essentially is the mechanism that on subsequent logins, when you go over to Google, Google sends back your identity, Salesforce now takes that and compares against this table and says, do I find this ID anywhere within previously logged in accounts over to that other identity provider? If it finds that information, then it says, I know how to link up. It then can go down into the update method. So let's look at that class real quick. Excuse me, let's look at that object real quickly. If I'm going too fast here too, people tell me to slow down. I know I get rolling and things get going. So I've already kind of, instead of having to log in and do all that stuff, I've already got this ready. But essentially with this third-party account link, you basically got the information that came over from the other system. Of course, there's a unique identifier for all of these things that come in. You've indicated, excuse me here again. Yeah, you've indicated who the provider is. This remote identifier, this is your identity in the other system. So this acts just like the federation ID when you're doing SAML, that's actually right on the user, because we've kind of linked everything up for SAML, but because these OpenID connects can be any of many different systems, it's hard to put a single field on the user ID itself, and that's why this separate table is done. But this remote identifier acts as your federation ID between Salesforce and between Google. So any subsequent logins, when this identifier comes back, Salesforce knows this person's already authenticated. I can go ahead and match up to this user, and then I can move forward and perform the updates. And again, you'll see every separate identity provider that you set up, if that person logs in through each of those, they'll end up setting records here. So if you provide the ability to log in through Google, through Twitter, through Facebook, through all of those, a person can use different ones as they come to your org, and it will keep track of all the different ones they've logged in. So subsequent times that they go to that identity provider, it'll be marked here. Now again, each one of those is going to have to do the same thing. They're going to have their own identifier within their system. You're going to have to define coming back in within that class that gets set up, that registration handler, how to identify what you're getting back to somebody that's in your own particular database. So that's pretty much with the class I define here in the actual create, how to link up to our own table, and then run my own create if I actually do need to create that user. Otherwise, we go down, and you can do whatever you want within the update. You can choose to do nothing. This particular one you saw that I commented out, setting the email, I kept getting, as I was testing this thing, I kept getting emails saying, hey, you're trying to change your email address, and it finally dawned on me because of this update of the user, it was trying to change my email, sending out the message that you normally get when you get an email. So I basically commented that out, saying I wanted to keep my email the same. One thing I did not indicate at the beginning here is before any of this is done, you have to set up your domain. That's kind of common whether you're doing OpenID Connect, doing SAML, any of the other things. You have to make sure initially that you have your domain set up. I kind of just skipped over that, but you'll see in all my URLs that I have here that it is in fact the domain name that transfers you over versus the standard Salesforce logins. So let's see this work. I'll go down and create myself a incognito window. Go to my domain. Sorry, I skipped one thing here, and I also did not. Now, so this is interesting. As you just saw, when I did that, I logged directly in. And the reason, sorry about that. Let me go down to the user. So what you'll see on the user record is we've looked before at what happens on logins. This is the login, but it's slightly different. And this is also why I came directly in due to single sign-on. It's not going to get it here, sorry. So our normal logins, if we come all the way to the end, you'll see all the different login types that are coming in. But what additionally you'll have here is when a third party is providing the identity, you'll start to set up the indication that those are happening. Very similar to connected apps. This just happens to be an auth provider, which does pretty much the same thing as a connected app. And what it's set up here is it's now provided a refresh token so that the next time I come to log in and it's able to match up my IDs, this is where the essentially the single sign-on or silent sign-on, however you want to pronounce it, comes in. Now you don't have to go out and enter your credentials because it knows that you've already come through. It's got all that link done, very similar to SAML. So now it can guide you right in. So in this particular case where I want to re-show how you're logging in, I'm just going to go in and revoke that refresh token for this particular ID. And just to make sure I've covered them both, I'm going to revoke that for both. And at this point, still was able to pick me up.
You're probably logged into your Google account in that browser session.
Right. You're probably right. This becomes interesting, but let me do it this way. I know through Edge it should not be able to find what I'm doing, so let me try it this way. Oops, still was able to find me.
I would try going to like your Gmail page and make sure you're logged out of Gmail because it probably realizes that you're already pre-signed in.
Normally when you get an incognito window, that helps. Because a lot of the cookies and whatnot you're using. There we go.
Ah.
Before I go on here, you'll notice here there's a basic page that Google's saying we're going to share your name, email address, profile picture, etc. There's a generic link for privacy policies and terms of conditions from Google. I'll go in a minute and show you where you can really change that, because you probably don't want Google providing those. If you're letting people into your service and wanting them to authenticate, you probably want to show your own privacy, your own terms, and indicate here's what we're going to get. Here's what's going to ultimately happen when we get that approval to come back. So there's ways to adjust that as well. I didn't set that up because you need a special verification and so forth, but I can tell you where all that stuff gets set up. So now you see from that point that I'm now logged in as I went to Google, provided my criteria, my login essentially, then it came back and brought me in. So now if I go back to my user record, you saw that I revoked those. You'll see that those are now back as far as the actual handler that I got in. So I'm back to the Google Plus, and now it's indicated that I have come in again. One of the things I forgot to show you is, you notice when I came up with the login page that I had the choice to use to log in as Google as well. And this is kind of one of the things we set up in SAML, but I'll just remind people, on your domain page, near the bottom is you can identify what particular authentications you want to allow. So the standard login page to let people just use their name and password. And then any of these auth providers you set up, as well as any of the SAML items you set up, all of those become available for you to also add those on a particular page. So by clicking any of them on, it then becomes options on that page. The next time you go to log in, it will default you to go to the last one you used, but you can always click that link that says, no, I want to log in a different way, and go back and pick one of the others. So the last thing I want to kind of show here is, let me log out again. You saw that in that, I'm going to completely go out and get a new window. You saw in that default that I didn't define any of the URLs coming back. But because I had picked Google, then Salesforce is going to help me there by knowing what the URLs to come back are. It's still going to send me in. So I'm essentially either define those URLs specifically, or because I defined it. So if I had gone through OpenID Connect, I could set up the exact same thing. I could put all the URLs and have it work by utilizing and telling it that I want Google, that I'm able to then not have to do those, and it understands how to put them. You may want to put them anyway. If Google were to ever change those, I'm not sure they would, but if they were to change those, that may end up having a negative impact. The last thing I want to show you is kind of interesting, how this works in a different way. So when I logged into Workbench, actually you guys didn't see me log into Workbench. So let me log out. One of the interesting parts is you can transfer this particular login to other applications as well. So in this particular case, Workbench, I want to log into Salesforce. And it logged me in, sorry. Now it knows I'm there. I may have to close this window as well. What I'm trying to show here is I'm going to log into Salesforce, but on the Salesforce screen that I'm going to bring up my domain, and I'm actually going to click the link to log into Google. So now it's going to route me over to Google to log in. That comes back to Salesforce that says that they're logged in, which then comes back to Workbench and says that he's logged in. So it's the ability, once you set these up, they kind of can chain themselves. See, it's going to take me in because it knows I'm there. But in effect, when you go to Workbench and says a Salesforce, down that little link where it says use a custom domain, you can click that. You can point back to your domain, which then pulls up the normal login screen for your domain, which in this particular case has your Google links. You could then go in and click the Google. You could log into Google, which logs into Salesforce, which transfers the identity and says you can log into Salesforce, which then transfers the identity and says you can log into Workbench. I'll stop there and see if there's any questions or anything someone wants me to go back and look at.
That's a mouthful.
Yes.
But the key there being, if you needed to log into Workbench and you went to just login.salesforce.com, those options wouldn't be there. You would have to go to your My Domain version of the login page.
Exactly.
To see those extra options.
Just like if you typed in here, if you just typed in login, you're not going to see those options because those only come up because you go to your special domain. So even if I go back here and say a different user, I don't have any of the options of the other two because you're going to login. You're going to Salesforce. Salesforce doesn't know yet that you're part of your domain, which has those special options. You're at the higher level that you're just trying to get into the front door at Salesforce.
Right. So you'd need to click that use custom domain link at the bottom right then, and then you'll get your login stuff. Then
you have to enter your domain, and then it will get to your page. Correct. So the key things here is you have to get a consumer key and a secret from Google. You then set up an auth provider that points to that and gives you the return URL that you go back to Google and set in. You then have to set up your registration handler, because you've got to tell the system how to distinguish existing users versus other, or it will just create everybody from scratch every time you come to that. Also within that method, you can go out and check to see, do I have any licenses left before you try to create, because that'll follow the same rules. I did that here when I first tried to create myself. My development org has all the users taken up, so you got an error back saying essentially you have no more licenses left. So you have to make sure you tell it how to match to your existing users. Then you can forward to the create if you want to create a new one, decide what you want to do in the update. Then you can just go through and test it.
Nice. Any questions from anybody? Don't forget to unmute if you have a question. All right. Thanks, Jeff. Satish,
Yep.
Are you back online?
Yeah.
Cool.
All right, let me share my screen. Jeff is still presenting. There you go. You see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think Jeff, thanks a lot for covering all that. That was a lot, and a lot of things that he covered is part of what I'm also going to cover. But hopefully, it'll be a refresher and also some of the concepts that we have to know for the exam. So there are two resource links that I really went through. One was the the communities help guide, and there is a winter implementation guide for communities, and within that it talks about authentication for communities. That was really helpful. And essentially what we're talking about is though we're talking about communities, I thought this would be useful to know, right? For authentication of both internal and external users into community, what that really means is not only your customers can get into community, sometimes your internal employees also need to go get into community, and there's a way to authenticate both of them, right? And external users are, your community portal, or any of the external identity or partner portal licenses. Internal users are your employees, with full Salesforce license capabilities, right? There are essentially 4 different types of authentications that you can have. One is definitely the basic auth, which is, you have the username, password, and you're managing all of that within Salesforce. Not really, a lot of big enterprises don't follow this because it's not a best practice, as we know. You have to manage yet another username and password, right? Or at least password. So that's one. Alternatively, what we can do is we can use SAML or an external authentication provider, or OAuth. So there are 3 different types of authentication mechanisms. And we all are familiar with SAML. So let me go to that. There's a little bit of maybe most of us actually have done SAML on the internal Salesforce org, but really not on the community. It's not quite a lot different. It's the same, but there are a few nuances that I thought would be helpful for us to touch upon. Again, SAML, we all know what SAML is, and what the standard is and what it needs, right? But for SAML for communities, there is some things that you have to consider. For example, the URL for the communities is completely different, and this is a community URL that your SAML assertion needs to include in the post, right? And maybe I can show. Again, I'm an extremely visual guy, so that's why it helps me to just go back into. So this is a single sign-on setup for community that I set up, and when I set this up, you can sort of see that you have the endpoints for your internal login. But look at how you have this. This is usually by default hidden, but if you expand it and open it up, these are the URLs for your community. So this will be the login URL for the community. This is the logout URL. This is the OAuth endpoint. And for a community, your entity ID is typically your community my domain that you have. I think that'd be useful for you to know. And as you know, you can have multiple single sign-on settings even for a community. So let's go back. And if you have multiple auth providers, right? And at the high level, the SAML flow, we all know what's involved, but in a community, the service provider here is really the community, right? So user will try to log in through the external, to the browser, to the community. The community will redirect to the single sign-on option. As soon as they select that, right, it goes back to the identity provider. The identity provider will then receive a SAML assertion. We'll log them in. So we'll provide the login screen. The user will log in, and the browser receives a SAML assertion. It posts it back to the community. Community logs it in based on that SAML assertion, and creates a session and creates a cookie. And it'll redirect, the browser will create a session that will redirect to the community. It performs the auth checks, and finally it loads it up. As Jeff mentioned, I mean, we saw that sort of in the external authentication stuff, right? But even the single sign-on, we know that there is pre-provisioning of users that we could provision, or there is just-in-time provisioning. So it's the same thing that we saw for SAML for internal users. Now, this is the other thing that I saw in the documentation in terms of some of the requirements for different types of users. And in case of a portal user, the SAML assertion is made to these URLs, whereas for community, it's a community URL. And our organization ID and portal ID required in assertion. In case of portals and sites, yes, you need org IDs and portal IDs as an attribute. For community, it depends, no by default, but if you're doing just-in-time provisioning, you need that. Is a site URL required. For community, it's passed as an attribute. Let's come down. I think this is just talking about the recipient URL. I think there's one nuance. There was one nuance where if you, as I mentioned, you could have multiple SAML configurations, right? So if you had multiple SAML configurations, then there is a specific format in which you have to provide the recipient URL. You have to actually have the /login and I believe this is the org ID, but there's a specific format. Let's go down. So that's SAML for communities. Anybody has any questions on that? Okay, so we can cover the questions also at the end if something comes up, and go over that stuff. The second way to really authenticate is authenticating through authentication providers. Again, Jeff covered a really good example using the Google authentication provider, right? As we know, the authentication providers could be different types. There is Facebook, there's Google. A lot of these guys internally also support the standard, which is the OpenID Connect, but some of them may not support it. So depending on which service it is, and if Salesforce supports that service, you can use that. And I sort of have a screenshot of, as of now, what are the different types of external providers that Salesforce partners with. And of course, if you use OpenID Connect, any OpenID Connect authentication provider will be able to authenticate you using that. Yeah, so there is a, you have the interface that's there for the authentication handler, like Jeff talked about, and needs to implement this, right? The registration handler needs to implement this. You can use the user data objects, attributes to check whether the user is internal or external. Again, I did not get a chance to play with this, so unless I do some of the hands-on, I probably won't learn a lot of nuances. But this is straight from the documentation. So it sounds like there's a way to introspect when the authentication provider comes in, whether that user is really an internal user or an external user. And for new users, obviously, that's something that, again, Jeff, maybe you can speak to this, but you wouldn't know because that's the first time a user is getting created. So you would have to use some sort of other mechanism to figure out whether it's internal or external. And obviously, if a user is authenticating, and we set it up as an authentication provider from Google, into a community, there's a way to set it up, and it goes to the community, and then we create the community user. So let's look at the different types of auth providers that are currently available. So as you saw, this Facebook. Janrain seems to be a special case, and it's mentioned in Salesforce documentation a lot of times. So I looked it up. It sounds to be a service that's a customer identity and access management solution. And again, I'm not personally familiar with this, so if anybody has any experience with this, maybe they can talk to this. Of course, the other nuance was Salesforce itself. It's interesting, and again, it's also a note in the Salesforce documentation that having a Salesforce auth provider sounds unusual, but it's used in cases where you want to allow somebody who's a Salesforce user and use their identity to log them into this particular community or your org, right? And in this case, it just happens to be a Salesforce identity. So these are the different types of auth providers that are there. And OpenID Connect would just be a standard that any OpenID supported auth provider could log you in. And like Jeff mentioned, there are nuances in terms of when you use the standard, when you use one of these options versus you use OpenID Connect, in terms of what are the steps that you have to follow. When you use some of these, there are ways to simplify your setup, and Salesforce does a lot of things for you. Like it manages the consumer secret and the consumer ID. I think I have that link somewhere. So at the high level, there are like the standard steps to configure auth provider. In this case, I've shown the same example with Google App, right? You have to set up a Google App, which will connect into the Salesforce org. Then you have to define a Google Authentication Provider within Salesforce org. Then you have to update the Google App with a callback URL for that either community, right? No, the callback URL for that Authentication Provider. And then you can test it. Let's come down. So this is an example. Again, I think a lot of this is covered previously. As you can see, there is a auth provider name. I'm not putting in the consumer ID secret. By default, Salesforce generated these URLs, so I'm not going to touch it. If I don't touch it, then it'll manage it on itself. And then there is so consumer ID, consumer secret are the standard for any OAuth mechanism. In this case, this is an OpenID Connect protocol, but it also uses a similar flows. As you can see, it uses the OAuth 2 flows here. So it uses the key and secret for authentication. Scopes, it's the same as in OAuth, and I'll go through some of the scopes that are as examples. Again, it depends on the auth provider and what scopes are there. And this sort of is the authorization part of it. What access to use. I do not know much about the custom. I think the customer error and the custom logout URL. Really, customer error is if there's any error during the authentication process, it'll just redirect you to that. And logout is for you to be able to log out using the custom logout. And like Jeff mentioned, this is a registration handler is a must. I mean, you can create this by clicking this button, and then you'd have to go and modify it to sort of find the user and update the user. And you would run that registration handler as a person that has access to create users, and typically it would be probably an administrator context. I was looking up for this field portal user, trying to figure out what portal user, and trying to figure out what this is. If somebody has any idea of what this is, maybe they can talk to. I couldn't quite figure out what this was.
Portal is a precursor to communities. It's not even offered as a service anymore. They stopped offering it in like 2013. So I'm guessing that's more for legacy orgs that might still have portals back when they were able to be provisioned.
That's helpful, because I was trying to see how to populate this box, and I was never getting anything in it. So it's a legacy one then. Okay.
But one important thing too,
right? Is that what that is?
Sorry.
Now it's called Community Portal?
Yeah, well, it's communities now. So Portal was replaced with communities.
Yeah, Jeff, you were saying something?
Yeah, one thing I forgot to point out that execute registration as, that becomes important when, if you're having errors when you're trying to run through, because that class that runs up above there, you want to debug that. Well, you have to go and decide who to turn the debug on for. And so that registration as, if you put one of your admins there initially starting things out, you can then go and turn debug on for that person, and you can see how it steps through that registration class if you're having problems getting, either your user validated or your user created. So that's, use those two in conjunction with each other. I didn't point that out.
Right. And the other thing to note here is best practice, this really should be a system account so that
Right.
you set it up for yourself and then you leave the company and now the registration handler doesn't work anymore because they've deactivated your account.
Yep. So you set up as yourself to get testing, and then you switch it over before you ever go live with this to make sure it doesn't shut off. And the last thing I didn't mention while you're here, that define scope, if you don't put OpenID in there, then this will not work. That's one of the scopes you have to do. If you're having somebody else provide the identity for you, you have to at least provide the OpenID scope in order to have all this hook up right.
Right, because the OpenID scope is what's going to give you back that OpenID formatted information. And we'll dive in more into that when we get into OAuth. But yeah, that's very important.
Those are great points. And Jeff, when you're setting this up by default, and again, I did this, I didn't fill this in. I'm guessing Salesforce did that for us behind the scenes when you use the default that you don't fill in things.
I think it did get put in there
later on. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It updates it. Okay. I'll have to check that. But that's good. That's good points. And the debug one was definitely a good point, and that refreshes my mind. It's been a long time since I worked on communities. There was definitely that issue, and because if you use a certain user that has less activity or whoever that is, it's easier for your debug the registration. Let me go down and see. Oh yeah, I had use the scope parameters, right? Again, this is for you to customize the permissions requested from a third party. And this is an example of how the scopes are being passed. In this case, there's an ID, API, and web. These are the three scopes that are being passed. Use Salesforce managed values in Auth Provider setup page. I mean, this is, I think, again, I talked about the same thing. Salesforce has this in this documentation. To use Salesforce managed values, it says leave these as blank, but it's really not blank because it generates, at least when I created the first time created the Auth Provider, it generated these three, so you don't have to blank them out. It'll manage that for you, and you may not see these things, but like Jeff was saying, maybe you could see some of these. So I'd have to check myself personally. I didn't do that. So let's look at this. Another thing that I wanted to show, and this also was covered before, was in the communities. When you go to the administration under the communities and you go to login and registration, now once you set up the external auth providers, you will see each of these external auth providers, and when you select those, then they'll start appearing in your login page. It's the same thing for single sign-on as well. And again, although I couldn't get the Axiom one to show up because I couldn't quite get the setting right, but you can definitely, for your external community users, show a way to log into a single sign-on as a separate option. If you happen to have multiple authentication mechanisms, one through social, one through a single sign-on, then you can definitely, that can show up. So this is how you do it. I think there's an example of, again, you saw this, so how it shows up, the external auth provider that we selected, sign in with Google, or you could sign in with your username password. If you're not a member in this case, it's also configured for that registering an external user. Yeah, so create a custom authentication provider plugin. I thought this was interesting. This is, again, so a lot of these authentication providers, they already, they're standard, they're supported, and then you can use those. But if you, for whatever reason, wanted to create your own custom authentication provider, you could do that. And there's a whole bunch of documentation of how you do this, and then you can create some of the custom metadata types. Honestly, I haven't gotten a chance to go through the whole custom external authentication provider, but something that's good to know that there's an option that you have. And I don't know if anybody has any experience of when they had to do something like this, but I can imagine that maybe there is a service in your company that I don't know. And again, let me not speak to that. I think I would be only imagining things. So does anybody have experience with this custom authentication provider plugin? yeah, this seems to be something that you could, it's as an extension that provided by Salesforce if you need to do it. Maybe you have some social service or some service where you have to create this authentication provider. Okay, the third real different way to do this is using authentication flows with OAuth. And again, I'm not going to go through any deep on this one because we're going to go through OAuth. There is sounds like this is again a case where you can log into the community through either a custom mobile app or a custom branded app. I think behind the scenes, even the Salesforce mobile definitely uses a OAuth flow. There's a SAML somewhere involved in there. It's a dance between SAML and OAuth, but this is something that you can use for a branded app or a desktop app. And I haven't done any of them myself, other than using just standard Salesforce one, so I can't talk to the nuances. Community supports all available auth authentication flows. Again, this I thought was very important, interesting, except the auth flows that communities doesn't support is the username password auth flow and the SAML assertion flow. It doesn't support those two. Other than that, it supports all of the auth flows for a custom app to use, whether it's a user agent flow or other type of flow. When implementing brand auth flows for communities, yeah, you use the community URL to configure in the auth flows, and the community and the authentication flow directs to the application's approval page. Let me see, and there was some documentation, some examples in the documentation on how what was that community URL that you'd be using for this custom OAuth open flow, and Acme's if they have this customers, this is how their URL will look like, and then you have the client ID, client secret being passed, and once you get authenticated, then you get a token, and then after that, you didn't use the bearer token flow to pass the and then get the after you acquire the access token, you pass it as a bearer token later on, and this was an example of how you do that. And again, I think a lot of this probably will be clear in our minds when we go through the OAuth flows. We'll be digesting it, and this will probably make more sense. I think that's all I have. Okay, there's one other interesting note, which was that in multilingual communities, the login page for the community appears in the default language for the community. So to create a login page in other language, you have to use the visual source pages. I think I had that. I think that's the last thing that I have. Again, this was a lot, and I went through all of this documentation, but a lot of these, unless I felt myself that unless I tried it myself, hands-on, maybe there's a few things that I'd miss. Hopefully I covered some concepts for you guys. That I want to mention is that we might get confused with this, social sign-on. Really, the concept social sign-on really means that you are going into the Salesforce and configuring external authentication providers for your community users. So you go to your community, and then you select that external authentication provider as an authentication provider. That's really what social sign-on is. And I didn't cover the external identity part of it, but because I thought we already talked about how external identity can be used, and of course Salesforce identity can also be used for external users. I didn't put this here, so I just covered the three different authentication mechanisms for community users.
Okay, thank you, Satish. Jaseem, you are up. Hopefully you can get this done in 10 minutes.
Sorry about that.
All right, can you guys hear me? Jaseem
Yes.
here.
Let me stop sharing.
All right, 10 minutes. Let me see.
So I'm going to say this now. If we do go over, I did promise you the meeting would stop at 9. If you need to drop at 9, go ahead and drop if we run long. I am going to keep recording to finish Jaseem's presentation for future reference. So if you need to drop, come back and catch the end of the recording. But hopefully Jaseem can go really fast because Satish and Jeff covered a lot of ground.
Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So communities. So I'm gonna demo hopefully whatever Satish covered. in 10 minutes. So I have one community for you, which is called Partners. Let me go to incognito and all right. So Satish covered the first method that you can authenticate or you can log in to communities giving username and password, right? You can brand this page however you want. You can put your logo here. You can change the color here. All that can be done once you go to the administration in community and go to login and registration screen, and you will see the branding options here. But that's not what we are focusing on. So let's come down to the login page. Now, when you open up a community, by default, you will get a community builder page, where you have the login page defaulted. But you can see this drop down. You can have your own Visualforce page or your own custom page for you to brand your login page. And then so that's when your customers, when they come in, when they want to log into your community. But next question is, what if new customers come? If they haven't logged in and they haven't signed up, that's when we talk about registration or self-registration. And this is really crucial, when you have B2C kind of scenarios, right? So you have customers coming from all different sides. So instead of pre-provisioning them in advance, it's better to let them configure. So that's what you can do by clicking this checkbox, which says allow external users to self-register. Again, the same thing like login. You can brand this however you want. You can have your own Visualforce page. But key thing to notice here is when you especially for a community, when you talk about provisioning users, the key thing you need to remember is you need to have always a contact and associate that to an account. Okay, so when we talk about an account, it can be a business account when you have B2B, but in B2C case, it can be a person account, right? Because when you talk about account, you talk about websites, you talk about the phone number, you talk about the contacts associated to that account. So this account can be a business account or a person account. And the second point, when you talk about provisioning users for community, you need to have a user record, of course, which has the license that has access to communities, and also a profile that has access to communities. And that user record will be associated to this contact record. Okay, and then some key things to note here. Account type defines what user you can provision. For example, if it is a partner account, you can provision both customer and partner users. So I just want to touch that. Now, so let me set this up. So what I'm doing here is, when a user is registering or self-registering, associate that user to this profile. So I've created a profile called Partners. Now again, that profile should be part of this community. How you can set it up? You can go to members, and when you see here, you can see in the selected profiles, I've selected already Partners. So if that profile is not part of the community, it won't show up in this drop down. Okay, so let me click that again, associate that to Partners. Another key thing, I think this is an exam question: how do you set up personal account for self-registration? Person account for self-registration. Salesforce helps you here a little bit. They say if you have enabled person account, again, person account is not by default. You have to call Salesforce support to enable it. But if you enable person account, leave this account field empty. So then, you can provision person account by doing this.
One word of warning here, Jaseem, before you go on. One of the links in the official trail mix, it's an older post and it says self-registration isn't supported for person accounts. That is not true, as you see right there. Self-registration is definitely supported for person accounts now. So if you come across that, just be aware it's an old article and it's out of date.
All right. Fortunately, I didn't come across that article before this demo. All right, so let me save that. Once you save, when I refresh this login page, you will see something extra here. And you will see a link called not a member. So that means, if you're coming for the first time, you can hit that. You can put something like, let's say, JSP and jp@gmail.com and sign up. And you have some issue. Join the community. All right. Every time. Allow self-registers, partners. I think I set it up right. Okay. Let's move on. I need to debug why that's happening. Okay. So now the question is, it's not a real user experience, when you have to sign up first time when you come in, right? Because you see those screens all the time. That's when, like Satish and Jeff pointed out, we can set up social sign-on for communities as well. And how you set up, like you have seen, you go to Auth Provider, you set up social account, social authentication providers here. For the purpose of this demo, I left all this blank, all these fields blank. When you leave all these fields blank, Salesforce used the default app for authentication. So default app in Google for authentication. I've created a registration handler real quick. If you see here, I've updated this handler. Like Jeff pointed out, this handler has two key methods. It has to first implement the auth registration handler class. And what I'm focusing here is the create user method. Now, how does it identify it's a community user? I think it has this particular token in the attribute map called as a PC_network ID. Now I updated a little bit here. I said, select the account which says partners and select the profile which says partners for this purpose. Okay. So if you go to your administration page again, and let me select that Google to enable social sign-on for this community. Now, as soon as you save this and refresh your login, you'll see that Google comes in into picture. Okay, so once hopefully this goes without an issue. I have a dummy user here. Unable to find the user. Actually, that was deliberate because, as Jeff pointed out, you can debug your registration issues using this execute registration as user. I'm going to go into that. Natalya, everything is falling upside down. I've tried this once. For some reason, it's not happening.
It's the curse of being in demo mode. The demo gods are not with us today.
Let me show you that debug, how it is working, just to at least, okay, I've already have the debug. 1210, 1210. Okay, that's already there. I think it is unable to find the user, but it has to. Okay. Let me switch back to. Okay. Let's continue. Now, the third thing I wanted to show you guys is when you hit login and registration page. Not here. Okay, so the third option for you is single sign-on, right? As Satish pointed out. So when you go to single sign-on, I have a single sign-on enabled. So, again, you can log in with username and password, or you can use your social accounts to log in. But again, you need to give better user experience for your customers or partners. So that's when single sign-on come in. And like we have seen already, in single sign-on, you have the login URL for your communities, and if you have multiple communities, it'll show up here under for communities. So I'm going to go back to Axiom. We have already seen this before. So here I'm going to set up single sign-on. So let's take a user here. So let's say since I don't have a user already set up, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use just-in-time provisioning. Okay, so let's say if your user is new altogether and he's coming for the first time, we need to create a user on the fly, and that's when just-in-time user provisioning is set up. Now, if you edit here, one key thing you wanna remember here is if I enable this just-in-time provisioning, and if I keep Salesforce username as your identity type, Salesforce is not gonna let you go in, because as it is mentioned here, you have to use Federation ID for the SAML user ID type when you use just-in-time provisioning. So that's one thing which you need to remember. So it has to be always with Federation ID. Now, what happens in the backend is when a user come in with a Federation ID, Salesforce look up for this Federation ID to see if there is already a user. If Salesforce finds the user, it updates the user details except the username and Federation ID with all the necessary attributes that you have provided. If it doesn't find, it creates on the fly. So that's hopefully we will see that. Now, I couldn't make the standard work here. So you have the option to custom this just-in-time provisioning. So like what we have seen in the social sign-on, you can, Salesforce creates the class auto create for you, but you can have your own class as well. You can hit this lookup and you can select your own class. For the time being, I just selected auto create. And again, like social self-registration, you can execute this as you. Okay, so let's see how that works. Now I go to Axiom. I have put some Federation ID, which is not in my org. And then I need to have these fields selected. And in the recipient URL, you're authenticating against your community. So I need to go back to your community and select a login URL for the community. So for this use this recipient URL. Entity ID should match. For the time being, I just use the basic entity ID, which is matching here. And what else? For some reason, this portal is not. So when you select portal, that's when org ID and portal ID is required. But and I saw Satish mention this, when you use just-in-time provisioning, you need org ID. But for some reason, you don't have to. You can still go as standard and authenticate this. I tried this yesterday. Let's see if that works. Now, when it comes to just-in-time provisioning, you need to, like, if it is a community user, you need to provide the necessary attributes for your user. And like we saw in the beginning, when you talk about user provisioning for community, you need to have a contact, you need to have an account, right? And all the necessary user credential. So I have it selected here. I have the account ID here. I have the profile ID here. Now let's look into the class real quick. Now, like self-registration, this class is implementing a SAML JIT handler, SAML just-in-time handler. You'll see three methods here: handle user, handle contacts, and handle account. Okay, I've updated this a little bit so that our demo works. So again, you can customize your classes and you can select based on your business scenarios. All right, so let me make sure I have everything. And I have the community recipient URL. I'm requesting a SAML response here. And this is your assertion. Your assertion starts here. You have the subject. You have the subject somewhere here. And yeah, 1, 2, 3, 6, 7. And you have all the necessary attributes. So you'll see different attribute values here. Now the final. Yeah. Okay, so let's hit login. And this is when you can use your single sign-on validator. Unable to map the subject to a Salesforce, but this is just-in-time provisioning, so that should work.
Jaseem, let's keep going in the interest of time. We're over already, so.
Yeah, I think let me put one more. It's not working. I think that's all I have, Natalya.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, then I will take over presenting. Just a reminder, on Wednesday, we are starting OAuth Flows, and there we go. And so for next session, it looks like a lot of reading, but it's okay. You have 2 days to do it, and some of this won't take you as long. That third bullet down, if you read nothing else before Wednesday, I suggest you read that article, the which flow should I use? Super informative, has all the flow diagrams right there. So if that's the only thing you have time for in the next 3 days, that's the one you do. Wednesday's presenters are down below. I'm going to put a poll on the Slack channel because there is a lot of ground to cover with OAuth on whether we want to do strict time limits or whether you are open to having sessions run long to ensure the content is going to get covered. So look for that in the Slack channel, and it'll be simple majority on which way we go with it. So with that, we are done with this session. As always, I will hang out until the last person leaves, and we'll talk to you all on Wednesday.